It begins not with a royal banquet or a battle, but with silence, the kind of silence you find only in thick Bohemian forests, far from any trade route or strategic crossroad. There, between the trees and the uneasy fog, sits Hauska Castle, a Gothic structure rising from stone like a question mark carved into the earth. And in that silence, in the year 1612, a woman sits by a window that doesn't face any road. Her name was Markéta Vachova, born to minor nobility, with no great fortune, no famed lineage, and some might say no future. She was not beautiful in the way the court recorded. Her face was angular, her voice quiet, and her hands always occupied with letters, spindles, or prayer beads. She arrived at Hauska Castle on horseback, her cloak damp from rain, to be the third wife of a man twice her age, Jindrik Burka, of Duba, a landowner who kept more books than companions. The marriage was not unusual for its time. No love was expected. Yet, over the years, what grew between them wasn't affection, but routine. He read aloud from Jesuit treatises, and she listened. He mapped the stars. She corrected his Latin dot when he died in 1609 from what the local priest called a corruption of the lungs. Markéta wore the black veil without question. She dismissed the servants within weeks and began sealing rooms of the castle, one by one. Visitors noticed that fires no longer burned in half the hearths. The great hall was locked, and the chapel was cleared of its silver. She kept only 3 rooms open, her chamber, the library, and mysteriously the chapel above the pit. To understand Markéta's isolation, you must first understand Hauska Castle's original purpose, or, more accurately, the lack of one. Built in the 13th century, Hauska was not raised to defend borders, control land, or house armies. Instead, it was constructed over a massive vertical hole in the ground, a chasm so deep, according to local legend, that no bottom had ever been found. Locals called it the gateway to hell. Unlike other castles, Hauska's walls faced inward, protecting nothing. Windows were false. Fortifications made no military sense. Early records mention how monks were lowered into the pit by rope to bless it, only to emerge, screaming after hours in the dark. Their hair turned white by the 17th century. These stories had faded into peasant whispers, but Markéta paid them heed. Over the next 3 years, villagers noted strange patterns. At dusk, Markéta would walk from the library to the chapel, lantern in hand, accompanied by no one. No services were held there. No one was permitted inside. But each night she stayed there for exactly 40 minutes, emerging with hands blackened by soot and fingers ink-stained. Some say she burned letters. Others claimed she read from her husband's alchemical volumes. Even more peculiar was her decision to speak only in Latin during her rare interactions with tradesmen, with travelers, even with the rare priest who came to collect tithes. Called her the Silent Widow, because, while she spoke, she never explained. Markéta aged quickly. By 1612, at just 33, she had grown gaunt, her hair silvering at the temples. The ivy, creeping up Hauska's walls, was no faster than the rot setting into the castle's beams. She refused repairs, refused guests. Letters from relatives were returned unopened. Yet inside the library was immaculate. Candle wax cleaned daily, books dusted, margins annotated with such precision that modern historians have mistaken her. script for that of a trained monastic scribe. Some believe she was protecting secrets, theological, occult, or deeply personal. Others believe she was guarding something within the castle. In 1888, during renovations, workers found a hidden drawer in the desk beneath the east window of Marchetta's former chamber. Inside was a single bound book, her journal, written entirely in Latin. The pages contain no expressions of grief or madness. Instead, they catalogue a project, the translation of a lost text she refers to only as Liber Mulierum Damnatarum, the Book of the Damned Women. Its origin is unknown. In one entry, she notes, "They came in dreams, always at the foot of the bed, veiled in ash. They tell me I was not his third wife. I was the 14th. Another reads, "The pit does not breathe, it listens. The words must be spoken in silence." Historians dismiss the entries as symbolic, fragments of a woman succumbing to grief and spiritual delusion. But what remains puzzling is this. Several of the rituals described in her journal match early Baltic funerary customs, nearly forgotten by her time. And yet she records them with startling accuracy. No portrait of Marchetta survives. No confirmed burial site. No letters signed in her name outside of the journal. Yet fragments of her annotations have been found in books held at monasteries as far as southern Germany. She signed them with a symbol, a crescent moon crossed by a single downward pointing arrow. This symbol appears, coincidentally, in pre-Christian texts as a glyph for concealment. Was she a scholar, a grieving woman slipping into obsession, or something more ambiguous, a gatekeeper for a castle built not for men, but for memory? Why did she believe she was the 14th wife, when records confirm only 2 before her? And why did castle, without history, military use, or obvious purpose, receive royal funding for its maintenance well into the 18th century? When we left off, Marchetta Vachova had become a ghost within her own walls. Her daily routine was exacting. The rooms of Hauska Castle slowly closing in like the chapters of a book left unfinished. And while the nearby villagers could only speculate at her silence, the truth, or something like it, was folded away into correspondence she never intended to mail. Because among the findings in that secret desk drawer wasn't just a journal, but 6 unsent letters, written in Latin, addressed to no known recipients. They were tucked between pages, as though waiting for some ritual or alignment that never came. Let us now examine what she tried and failed to send into the world. They told me to write this plainly, as if it were a confession. But I have confessed nothing, not to the priests, not to the mirror, least of all to the pit. I was not the first to kneel before it. I will not be the last. This first letter is the shortest, and perhaps the most cryptic, historians believe. It was written in the 2nd year of her widowhood, judging by the handwriting and ink. There are subtle changes in her pen strokes between this and the 5th or 6th letters, a kind of trembling that crept in over time. But it's the mention of the mirror that becomes important later. There were no mirrors remaining in the castle. When it was surveyed in 1789, not even shards, but there are multiple references in her writings to the 4 mirrors, not of glass, but of memory. This idea will return. You wore blue on your wedding day. They said it rained for hours, and still you insisted on entering the chapel on foot. The mud ruined your hem. but you smiled anyway. I have read your note. It was hidden beneath the stone tile behind the altar, where no one was meant to find it. I know now what he meant by the phrase, my third wife. It was never chronological. It was numerical, perhaps symbolic. He only ever saw 3 of us. This letter is where speculation begins to mount. Marketa seems to be addressing a previous mistress of the castle, someone whose existence was not officially recorded, but whose message she had discovered hidden in the chapel's foundation. Tile she references was confirmed to exist one slate slab looser than the rest. Nothing was found beneath it in the 19th century inspection, but by then centuries had passed. Let's revisit the architecture of Hauska Castle, because this chapel was not built on sacred ground. In fact, it was intentionally constructed over the central pit, sealing it literally and spiritually. That decision was made in the late 1200s, based on the belief that holy ground could suppress demonic forces. But Marketa's letters and marginalia challenge this assumption. She wrote, "The chapel is not a seal, it is a filter, a sieve. What escapes is not flame or shadow, but memory without form, pain with no owner." Whether or not you believe this, what matters is that she believed it, and it shaped her descent into obsession. These letters are longer and more technical, detailing the use of what she calls specula, dolores, mirrors of sorrow. Each one was to be placed in a cardinal position, north, facing the library, south, opposite the chapel, east, toward her chamber, west, into the forest. Their purpose, to reflect only what cannot be remembered, to cast back the faces that do not belong to the present. Marketa describes a ritual that required each mirror to be polished with lamp black and oil from extinguished tallow candles, then bound with a strip of linen taken from a funerary garment. She refers again to the 14th name, a phrase that appears in multiple contexts but is never fully explained. One possibility is that she believed the castle itself remembered the women who had lived and perhaps died within its walls, women who were not recorded in property deeds, wills, or church records, women who were unofficial. At this point, one must ask, what was the role of Jindrik Burka of Duba, her late husband? Was he simply a bookish noble with an interest in astronomy? Or was his library a euphemism for something darker? According to Marketa, he believed, himself the last link in the chain, that by marrying again he might finally break the pattern. He was wrong. I showed him the ledger. I showed him her name, scratched in copper ink. No record of such a ledger has been found, but it's worth noting that copper ink was rare and expensive, often used in the illumination of banned or occult manuscripts, especially in regions like Bohemia, where mystical Christian sects thrived under Catholic suppression. We begin to see that perhaps Marketa's mission was not madness, but continuation. She was translating, preserving, finishing something. I do not fear death. I fear the persistence of emotion beyond decay. The heart may stop, but what of grief? If it outlasts the body, it must anchor itself somewhere. Stone, paper, ash. That is why the pit speaks. It is not a mouth, but an ear. This idea that emotions outlast bodies recurs in several folkloric traditions in Central and Eastern Europe. Grief and guilt are said to linger in physical materials. In this case, Hauska stone is seen not as barrier, but receptacle. Marchetta's goal may not have been to silence the voices, but to understand them, to catalog them. They will come when the moon is halved. I will not speak, I will not resist. The mirrors are set, the pit is calm. I leave this not as warning, but as invitation. We are never the first to ask, only the first to listen. This final letter is dated March 7th, 1612, roughly when her presence in local tax records ends. No death certificate, no funeral, just silence. There are a few prevailing theories among historians. Escape, that she left Hauska quietly, perhaps to a cloister or abroad, abandoning her identity and role. Suicide, that she succumbed to despair and ended her life in one of the castle's unused wings. Murder, that someone, perhaps from the church or noble family, removed her to silence her inquiries. Something else, that she entered a state of isolation so complete she may have simply died in one of the sealed rooms, only to be discovered decades or centuries later without identification. What remains undeniable is the influence her writings had on later spiritualists. In 1911, a German mystic named Helmut Grohmann cited Marchetta's journal as a primary inspiration for his thesis on cognitive hauntings, memories that possess objects rather than people. He called her the first archivist of sorrow. Why? Was her journal written in Latin when her other annotations used Czech and German? Was it for secrecy, for protection, or was she writing to someone not yet born, in a language that might survive her? When restoration workers began clearing the west wing of Hauska Castle in the summer of 1823, they noticed a curious feature: a door without a handle. No hinges were visible, no signs of a lock. It had been sealed with melted wax, dozens of layers fused together into a crude red-black crust. The chamber behind it hadn't appeared on any architectural plans. The plaster surrounding the threshold was original, dating back centuries. It took them 3 days to breach the wall. What they found behind it would not have made headlines, not in any scandalous sense. There was no skeleton, no treasure, no crypt, only a single room, 6 feet by 6 feet. With walls lined entirely in handwritten pages, thousands of them, stitched together by twine and tallow, and in the center, on a raised stone platform, a broken mirror. The papers were fragile, but a few hundred were recoverable. Bound later by archivists in Prague, they are now referred to as the Vachova Fragmenta, a collection of theological notes, linguistic puzzles, and spiritual meditations written between 1610 and 1612. They are not arranged chronologically, nor are they organized by subject. Some are repetitive, others contradict previous entries. Many were written during what appear to be trances or dissociative states, where Marchetta refers to herself in the third person or uses archaic pronouns, common in Old Church Slavonic. A few recurring phrases stand out. Memory as matter. 14 become one in glass. Time devours the loud, but forgets the quiet. Therefore I whisper. There are also diagrams, circles intersected by names, some crossed out. In one diagram, a word appears repeatedly: ossuaria, Latin for bone room or charnel house. But perhaps the most enigmatic discovery was a folded vellum tucked in the far corner, labeled simply, "He remains." This document, fewer than 800 words, is written in a mix of Latin and a phonetic cipher, partially decrypted by linguists in the 1990s. It tells the story of a man entombed but never dead. not physically, but emotionally, suspended, his grief preserved across centuries through repeated rituals of remembrance by others. The ritual, a cycle of wives, each destined to experience the same solitude, the same questions, the same fading dot. It suggests that Hauska Castle was built not to trap evil, but to contain a sorrow so ancient it became sentient. He does not haunt, he echoes. He waits for each to leave their shape behind, to wear it for a while. We are all his wives. But it is the only document in which Marketa signs her full name, followed by a series of symbols resembling lunar phases, ending in a single black circle. The ink was copper. One puzzle remained, the broken mirror at the center of the hidden room. When examined by curators, they discovered something unexpected. The backing was not made of silver, as was typical, but of smoked obsidian. This would have rendered the mirror functionally useless for ordinary reflection, instead producing a dark, dim haze when looked into. Such scrying mirrors were used in pre-Christian ritual across Central Europe, particularly in divination and memory retrieval. It is likely then that Marketa was attempting to do just that, not to gaze into the future, but to look backward through memory, time, and silence. Obsidian mirrors absorb more light than they reflect. They show you what you miss. Even today, Hauska Castle remains a curiosity for tourists and mystics alike. Its strange construction, inward-facing walls, an oddly placed chapel continue to draw theories from the rational to the paranormal. But in recent years, it is Marketa's story that has taken center stage. In 2018, a team of cultural historians conducted a detailed resurvey of the castle, now open to visitors. Their report found that beneath the chapel floor were the faint remains of script etched into the stone, letters not visible without ultraviolet light. The language, Old Latin, the phrase repeated again and again, "Listen through the stone." Grief is an archive. Why should we care about a woman who may have simply gone mad? Because history, as it is commonly told, rarely makes room for quiet women, for invisible sorrow, or for the kind of legacies that don't involve battles, bloodlines, or banners. Marketa Vachova did not conquer a city. She did not change a dynasty. She left behind only annotations, echoes, and a kind of emotional archaeology so subtle it almost vanished. Yet what she explored, the persistence of emotion, the architecture of memory, the belief that the past resides in stone and paper, these are ideas that still resonate. We are, after all, still trying to figure out what grief does when no one is listening. And in that way, she might have been right. The castle is not a place. It is a function, a device, a container for emotion. What else is history, if not that? How many other castles were built not to house armies, but to seal away sorrow, too complex for words? And how many more Marketas went unwritten there? Archives burned, their mirrors broken, all because they whispered instead of shouted. Long before Versailles dazzled with its gold leaf and manicured hedges, there was the Château de Vincennes, built not for spectacle, but for seclusion, a fortress palace of limestone and shadows, rising from the flatlands east of Paris, like a monument to secrecy. Its tall towers did not invite, they discouraged. Its thick curtain walls did not protect royalty from threats. They protected their secrets from the world. And in the winter of 1659, one of those secrets took the shape of a woman, Jeanne Leonore de Vaudemont. daughter of an obscure Lorraine noble, recently arrived at court as the new lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Austria, widow of Louis XIII. Jean was 19, literate in Latin, Spanish, and Italian. She was fond of playing the viola da gamba, and she had a peculiar fascination with sealing wax, always keeping a ring of colors on her person. But what most remembered, what they whispered behind her back, was the silence she carried with her. Not shyness, exactly, but a kind of watchful restraint, as if every word she chose had already been measured against some unwritten code. And when she was quietly assigned quarters at Vincennes rather than Versailles, it was assumed. This was not exile, but positioning. Someone trusted her. Someone also wanted her out of sight.
By the 17th century, these stories had faded into peasant whispers, but Marquetta paid them heed. Over the next 3 years, villagers noted strange patterns. At dusk, Marquetta would walk from the library to the chapel, lantern in hand, accompanied by no one. No services were held there. No one was permitted inside. But each night she stayed there for exactly 40 minutes, emerging with hands blackened by soot and fingers ink-stained. Some say she burned letters. Others claimed she read from her husband's alchemical volumes. Even more peculiar was her decision to speak only in Latin during her rare interactions with tradesmen, with travelers, even with a rare priest who came to collect tithes. They called her the Silent Widow because while she spoke, she never explained. Marquetta aged quickly. By 1612, at just 33, she had grown gaunt, her hair silvering at the temples. The ivy creeping up Hauska's walls was no faster than the rot setting into the castle's beams. She refused repairs, refused guests. Letters from relatives were returned unopened. Yet inside, the library was immaculate. Candle wax cleaned daily, books dusted, margins annotated with such precision that modern historians have mistaken her script for that of a trained monastic scribe. Some believe she was protecting secrets, theological, occult, or deeply personal. Others believe she was guarding something within the castle. In 1888, during renovations, workers found a hidden drawer in the desk beneath the east window of Marquetta's former chamber. Inside was a single-bound book, her journal, written entirely in Latin. The pages contained no expressions of grief or madness. Instead, they catalog a project. The translation of lost text she refers to only as Liber Mulierum Damnatarum, the Book of the Damned Women. Its origin is unknown. In one entry, she notes, "They came in dreams, always at the foot of the bed, veiled in ash. They tell me I was not his third wife. I was the 14th. Another reads, "The pit does not breathe. It listens. The words must be spoken in silence." Historians dismiss the entries as symbolic, fragments of a woman succumbing to grief and spiritual delusion. But what remains puzzling is this. Several of the rituals described in her journal match early Baltic funerary customs, nearly forgotten by her time, and yet she records them with startling accuracy. No portrait of Marquetta survives. No confirmed burial site. No letter signed in her name outside of the journal. Yet fragments of her annotations have been found in books held at monasteries as far as southern Germany. She signed them with a symbol, a crescent moon crossed by a single downward-pointing arrow. This symbol appears, coincidentally, in pre-Christian texts as a glyph for concealment. Was she a scholar? A grieving woman slipping into obsession? Or something more ambiguous? A gatekeeper for a castle built not for men, but for memory? Why did she believe she was a 14th wife, when records confirm only 2 before her? And why did Hauska Castle, without history, military use, or obvious purpose, receive royal funding for its maintenance well into the 18th century? When we left off, Marquetta Vachova had become a ghost within her own walls. Her daily routine was exacting, the rooms of Hauska Castle slowly closing in like the chapters of a book left unfinished. And while the nearby villagers could only speculate at her silence, the truth, or something like it, was folded away into correspondence she never intended to mail. Because among the findings in that secret desk drawer wasn't just a journal, but 6 unsent letters, written in Latin, addressed to no known recipient. They were tucked between pages as though waiting for some ritual or alignment that never came. Let us now examine what she tried and failed to send into the world. They told me to write this plainly, as if it were a confession, but I have confessed nothing, not to the priests, not to the mirror, least of all to the pit. I was not the first to kneel before it. I will not be the last. This first letter is the shortest and perhaps the most cryptic. Historians believe it was written in the second year of her widowhood, judging by the handwriting and ink. There are subtle changes in her pen strokes between this and the fifth or sixth letters, a kind of trembling that crept in over time. But it's the mention of the mirror that becomes important later. There were no mirrors remaining in the castle when it was surveyed in 1789, not even shards. But there are multiple references in her writings to the 4 mirrors, not glass, but of memory. This idea will return. You wore blue on your wedding day. They said it rained for hours, and still you insisted on entering the chapel on foot. The mud ruined your hem, but you smiled anyway. I have read your note. It was hidden beneath the stone tile behind the altar, where no one was meant to find it. I know now what he meant by the phrase, my third wife. It was never chronological. It was numerical, perhaps symbolic. He only ever saw 3 of us. This letter is where speculation begins to mount. Marquetta seems to be addressing a previous mistress of the castle, someone whose existence was not officially recorded, but whose message she had discovered hidden in the chapel's foundation. The tile she references was confirmed to exist, one slate slab looser than the rest. Nothing was found beneath it in the 19th century inspection, but by then, centuries had passed. Let's revisit the architecture of Hauska Castle, because this chapel was not built on sacred ground. In fact, it was intentionally constructed over the central pit, sealing it literally and spiritually. That decision was made in the late 1200s, based on the belief that holy ground could suppress demonic forces. But Marquetta's letters and marginalia challenged this assumption. She wrote, "The chapel is not a seal. It is a filter, a sieve. What escapes is not flame or shadow, but memory without form, pain with no owner." Whether or not you believe this, what matters is that she believed it, and it shaped her descent into obsession. These letters are longer and more technical, detailing the use of what she calls specula doloris, mirrors of sorrow. Each one was to be placed in a cardinal position. North, facing the library. South, opposite the chapel. East, toward her chamber. West, into the forest. Their purpose? To reflect only what cannot be remembered, to cast back the faces that do not belong to the present. Marquetta described a ritual that required each mirror to be polished with lampblack and oil from extinguished tallow candles, then bound with strip of linen taken from a funerary garment. She refers again to the 14th name, a phrase that appears in multiple contexts but is never fully explained. One possibility is that she believed the castle itself remembered the women who had lived and perhaps died within its walls. Women who were not recorded in property deeds, wills, or church records. Women who were unofficial. At this point, one must ask, what was the role of Ginderberka of Duba, her late husband? Was he simply a bookish noble with an interest in astronomy? Or was his library a euphemism for something darker? According to Marquetta, he believed himself the last link in the chain, that by marrying again, he might finally break the pattern. He was wrong. I showed him the ledger. I showed him her name, scratched in copper ink. No record of such a ledger has been found, but it's worth noting that copper ink was rare and expensive, often used in the illumination of banned or occult manuscripts, especially in regions like Bohemia, where mystical Christian sects thrived under Catholic suppression. We begin to see that perhaps Marquetta's mission was not madness, but continuation. She was translating, preserving, finishing something. I do not fear death. I fear the persistence of emotion beyond decay. The heart may stop, but what of grief? If it outlasts the body, it must anchor itself somewhere. Stone, paper, ash. That is why the pit speaks. It is not a mouth, but an ear. This idea, that emotions outlast bodies, recurs in several folklore traditions in Central and Eastern Europe. Grief and guilt are said to linger in physical materials. In this case, Hauska stone is seen not as barrier, but receptacle. Marketta's goal may not have been to silence the voices, but to understand them, to catalog them. They will come when the moon is halved. I will not speak. I will not resist. The mirrors are set. The pit is calm. I leave this not as warning, but as invitation. We are never the first to ask, only the first to listen. This final letter is dated March 7th, 1612, roughly when her presence in local tax records ends. No death certificate, no funeral, just silence. There are a few prevailing theories among historians. Escape, that she left Hauska quietly, perhaps to a cloister or abroad, abandoning her identity and role. Suicide, that she succumbed to despair and ended her life in one of the castle's Enyu's wings. Murder, that someone, perhaps from the church or noble family, removed her to silence her inquiries. Something else, that she entered a state of isolation so complete she may have simply died in one of the sealed rooms, only to be discovered decades or centuries later without identification. What remains undeniable is the influence her writings had on later spiritualists. In 1911, a German mystic named Helmut Grossmann cited Marketta's journal as a primary inspiration for his thesis on cognitive hauntings, memories that possess objects rather than people. He called her the first archivist of sorrow. Why was her journal written in Latin when her other annotations used Czech and German? Was it for secrecy, for protection, or was she writing to someone not yet born in a language that might survive her? When restoration workers began clearing the west wing of Hauska Castle in the summer of 1823, they noticed a curious feature: a door without a handle. No hinges were visible, no signs of a lock. It had been sealed with melted wax. Dozens of layers, fused together into a crude red-black crust. The chamber behind it hadn't appeared on any architectural plans. The plaster surrounding the threshold was original, dating back centuries. It took them 3 days to breach the wall. What they found behind it would not have made headlines, not in any scandalous sense. There was no skeleton, no treasure, no crypt, only a single room, 6 feet by 6 feet, with walls lined entirely in handwritten pages. Thousands of them, stitched together by twine and tallow. And in the center, on a raised stone platform, a broken mirror. The papers were fragile, but a few hundred were recoverable, bound later by archivists in Prague. They are now referred to as a Vachova Fragmenta, a collection of theological notes, linguistic puzzles, and spiritual meditations written between 1610 and 1612. They are not arranged chronologically, nor are they organized by subject. Some are repetitive. Others contradict previous entries. Many were written during what appear to be trances or dissociative states, where Marketta refers to herself in the third person, or uses archaic pronouns common in Old Church Slavonic. A few recurring phrases stand out. Memory as matter. 14 become one in glass. Time devours the loud but forgets the quiet. Therefore I whisper. There are also diagrams, circles intersected by names, some crossed out. In one diagram, a word appears repeatedly: ossuaria, Latin for bone room or charnel house. But perhaps the most enigmatic discovery was a folded vellum tucked in the far corner, labeled simply, "Here remains." This document, fewer than 800 words, is written in a mix of Latin and a phonetic cipher, partially decrypted by linguists in the 1990s. It tells the story of a man entombed but never dead, not physically, but emotionally suspended, his grief preserved across centuries through repeated rituals of remembrance by others. The ritual, a cycle of wives, each destined to experience the same solitude, the same questions, the same fading. It suggests that Hauska Castle was built not to trap evil, but to contain a sorrow so ancient it became sentient. He does not haunt. He echoes. He waits for each to leave their shape behind, to wear for a while. We are all his wives. It's unclear whether this was myth, metaphor, or delusion, but it is the only document in which Marketta signs her full name, followed by a series of symbols resembling lunar phases, ending in a single black circle. The ink was copper. One puzzle remained: the broken mirror at the center of the hidden room. When examined by curators, they discovered something unexpected. The backing was not made of silver, as was typical, but of smoked obsidian. This would have rendered the mirror functionally useless for ordinary reflection, instead producing a dark, dim haze when looked into. Such scrying mirrors were used in pre-Christian ritual across Central Europe, particularly in divination and memory retrieval. It is likely, then, that Marquetta was attempting to do just that, not to gaze into the future, but to look backward through memory, time, and silence. Obsidian mirrors absorb more light than they reflect, which is perhaps why she called them mirrors of sorrow. They don't show you yourself. They show you what you miss. Even today, Hauska Castle remains a curiosity for tourists and mystics alike. Its strange construction, inward-facing walls, and oddly placed chapel continue to draw theories, from the rational to the paranormal. But in recent years, it is Marquetta's story that has taken center stage. In 2018, a team of cultural historians conducted a detailed resurvey of the castle, now open to visitors. Their report found that, beneath the chapel floor, were the faint remains of script etched into the stone, letters not visible without ultraviolet light. The language? Old Latin. The phrase repeated again and again. Listen through the stone. Grief is an archive. Why should we care about a woman who may have simply gone mad? Because history, as is commonly told, rarely makes room for quiet women, for invisible sorrow, or for the kind of legacies that don't involve battles, bloodlines, or banners. Marquetta Vachova did not conquer a city. She did not change a dynasty. She left behind only annotations, echoes, and a kind of emotional archaeology so subtle it almost vanished. Yet what she explored, the persistence of emotion, the architecture of memory, the belief that the past resides in stone and paper, these are ideas that still resonate. We are, after all, still trying to figure out what grief does when no one is listening. And in that way, she might have been right. The castle is not a place. It is a function, a device, a container for emotion. What else is history if not that? How many other castles were built not to house armies, but to seal away sorrow too complex for words? And how many more Marquettas went unwritten, their archives burned, their mirrors broken, all because they whispered instead of shouted? Long before Versailles dazzled with its gold leaf and manicured hedges, there was the Chateau de Vincennes, built not for spectacle, but for seclusion, a fortress palace of limestone and shadows, rising from the flatlands east of Paris, like a monument to secrecy. Its tall towers did not invite, they discouraged. Its thick curtain walls did not protect royalty from threats. They protected their secrets from the world. And in the winter of 1659, one of those secrets took the shape of a woman. Gillianor de Vaudemont, daughter of an obscure Lorraine noble, recently arrived at court as the new lady-in-waiting to Queen of Austria, widow of Louis XIII. Jean was 19, literate in Latin, Spanish, and Italian. She was fond of playing the viola da gamba, and she had a peculiar fascination with sealing wax, always keeping a ring of colors on her person. But what most remembered, what they whispered behind her back, was the silence she carried with her. Not shyness, exactly, but a kind of watchful restraint, as if every word she chose had already been measured against some unwritten code. And when she was quietly assigned quarters at Vincennes, rather than Versailles, it was assumed this was not exile but positioning. Someone trusted her. Someone also wanted her out of sight. By the 17th century, Chateau de Vincennes had evolved beyond its original military function. Once the seat of kings like Charles V and Louis IX, it had become a hybrid of prison, archive, and discreet residence, a place for royal cousins, embarrassing mistresses, and scholars who had fallen out of favor. Its stone keep, nearly 52 meters tall, was Europe's tallest at the time. But unlike the celebratory architecture of Versailles, Vincennes bore the look of containment. Narrow staircases, cold, echoing halls, a moat that never quite dried, even in summer. It was a place for waiting, and Jean waited. Sometime in February 1660, her letters began. They were addressed to no single recipient. Some began with "my dearest," others with "the future," and a few simply with "J." They were not romantic in tone, not initially. Instead, they cataloged court affairs, quiet political shifts, and the small, crushing details of life in an isolated fortress. From letter number 3, today the wind came from the north. The towers moaned like widows, and no one lit a fire in the great hall. I believe they want me to forget warmth. From letter number 6. The new physician brought spices in his satchel. He dropped a note when he bowed. It contained only the phrase, in candela verba manet. I have placed it behind my mirror. Translation: in the candle, words remain. We know these letters existed only because they were found, hidden centuries later behind the panels of a writing desk in the storage room of Vincennes. The desk had belonged to a chamberlain of Louis XIV, but its final drawer had been jammed shut, requiring restoration teams in 1921 to break it open. Inside were 22 letters, folded precisely, tied with a silk ribbon of faded violet. The ink was iron gall, common at the time, and had bled slightly into the fibers of the parchment, suggesting the letters were sealed quickly after writing. But here's the oddity. None had ever been posted. There were no outer addresses, no signs of delivery, and yet some bore wax seals, pressed using an unknown signet, a symbol of interlocking keys over a crescent moon. What were these letters for? Who were they meant for? By April 1660, according to surviving court documents, Jean had not left the Chateau de Vincennes in over 3 months. There are no records of her committing any crime, no scandal attached to her name, no mention in court gossip sheets. Yet Queen Anne's letter suggests that Jean had become a silent observer in a matter involving Spanish envoys and a forbidden correspondence between French nobles and a Jesuit faction in Rome. Could Jean have been a courier, a double agent, or simply a woman caught in a web of secrets she never agreed to untangle? Letter number 11 is longer than the others, and its tone changes. No longer observational, it becomes personal, even mournful. I hear you speak in my sleep now. The words are not yours, but they were your accent. They speak of warmth, and I do not remember what it means. Did you mean for me to keep the letters? Did you mean for them never to reach you? This implies that she was never meant to send them, that perhaps they were a ritual, a containment method. Not unlike the whisperings of Marketa Vachova, Jean too began to treat writing not as communication, but as preservation. Some historians believe that Vincennes functioned as more than a prison, that in the mid-17th century, it operated as a kind of emotional quarantine zone. Individuals connected to dangerous knowledge or compromised loyalties were sent not to die, but to be forgotten. Jean may have held information she was never meant to repeat, knowledge about a diplomatic betrayal, or a liaison between someone at court and a Spanish royal figure. But without evidence, it remains speculation. Still, the fact that her letters were hidden, carefully preserved, and written in what some call controlled despair suggests she knew exactly what she was doing. This letter is unsigned, untitled, and far shorter than the others. I loved you for your handwriting first. Before your voice, before your gifts, before the garden walk. It was the way you crossed your T's so gently. That softness was your mistake. This is the closest Jean ever comes to an admission of intimacy. But with whom? No name is given. No initials. Only the context of gifts and the garden walk. Perhaps a rendezvous at Vincennes or earlier at the court. Whoever this person was, their connection to Jean was quiet, deep, and, crucially, unsanctioned. Among the letters was a small object wrapped in cloth, a sealing wax ring, containing 5 color blocks melted together, black, violet, white, dark red, and gold. Scholars have debated its meaning for decades, but one theory stands out. These were the colors of 5 noble houses involved in secret correspondence with Spain over the Treaty of the Pyrenees. The treaty, signed in late 1659, ended the long-standing war between France and Spain. And yet, parts of it were shrouded in private terms, including the arranged marriage of Louis XIV to Maria Theresa of Spain. It's possible Jean witnessed or facilitated one of these private deals, and when her usefulness ended, she was placed where letters go to die. In 1661, Jean's name appears once more in an inventory of the Vincennes kitchens, where a note reads, 3 meals no longer required in the south wing, 1 bed cleared, 1 lantern extinguished. There is no mention of death, no burial record, just an absence. Why were her letters hidden in a desk belonging to someone else? Was it accident or intention? Did Jean herself place them there, knowing she'd be forgotten, hoping someone would eventually find them? Or were they removed by someone who cared? Someone who could not bear to burn her words, even if he could never read them again? In the spring of 1660, while Paris prepared to celebrate the royal betrothal of Louis XIV to Maria Theresa of Spain, far from spectacle, Jill Leonore de Vaudemont continued to write letters no one would receive. She wrote by candlelight in her narrow chamber in the south wing of Vincennes. The window faced a stone wall. The room had no fireplace. Her writing desk, a simple walnut piece with a warped leg, would eventually become the hiding place for her story. But in April 1660, that future was not promised. All she had was ink, memory, and the peculiar insignia she began pressing into wax. 2 interlocking keys, crossed beneath a crescent moon. This symbol did not belong to any known noble house, nor did it match the ecclesiastical emblems of France or Spain, but it does appear in 2 obscure places. A page of diplomatic cipher instructions, housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Catalogued as part of the Mazarin Papers, a massive archive of Cardinal Mazarin's correspondence during his tenure as Chief Minister of France. An engraved seal ring, discovered in 1799 during renovations of a Jesuit crypt in Avignon, bearing the same image, alongside the Latin inscription, Clavis Veritatis Silentis, the key of silent truth. Scholars now believe this insignia may belong to a discreet network of informants and negotiators maintained by Cardinal Mazarin to navigate the tangled political terrain between Catholic powers, a network of those not quite spies, but never quite visible. Could Jean have been one of them? Letter number 18 references a brief, but revealing memory. You brushed snow from my shoulder like it was a blessing. I told you about the letters I had never sent. You told me some truths are safer when they don't echo. Was that kindness or containment? Many believe this passage points to Charles-Henri de Latour, an assistant to Cardinal Mazarin, known to have visited Vincennes 3 times in the winter of 1659. Officially, he was delivering documents. Unofficially, there is speculation that he was Jean's handler or her lover, perhaps both. What adds weight to this theory is that a journal kept by Latour, now partially damaged, includes a curious line in its February 1660 entry. J remains committed to the role, but her ink has grown sorrowful. By the mid-1600s, France was relying less on formal embassies and more on silent couriers, individuals embedded in royal courts, religious houses, or noble households who could gather subtle information. They were trained to observe, record, and disappear. Jean may have been part of such a system, chosen not for rank or bravado, but for restraint, invisibility, and loyalty. If this is true, it explains her unusual appointment to Vincennes, not Versailles, her linguistic fluency, Latin, Italian, Spanish, in a court where most ladies-in-waiting barely spoke beyond French. The presence of a ciphered phrase, in candela, verba manet, left by a physician, possibly another courier, and it explains a pattern in her letters. Detailed political observations, encoded memories, and phrases repeated with minor variations, possibly indicating shifting keyed ciphers. Researchers from the University of Strasbourg in 1994 analyzed the syntax of Jean's letters and discovered that every third letter contained sequences of Latin phrases with repeated character patterns, which, when rearranged, suggested a date, May 2nd, 1660, a location, courtyard of St. John Tower, a word, succession. This may have pointed to a planned meeting or intelligence drop, possibly the moment when Jean handed off her final report or was intercepted. We may never know what happened on that date. What we do know is that Jean's letter stopped abruptly after late April. Her last legible letter, number 22, ends with, "I will sleep now, with the wax still warm. The keys wait. The moon wanes." No mention of fear. No appeal for rescue. Just a calm acceptance, like someone completing an assignment, or someone who knew no further writing would be allowed. A deeper examination of the wax ring found with the letters revealed something unexpected. A sliver of fabric embedded in the black wax segment. Under microscopy, the cloth was found to be monogrammed, though partially burned. The visible letters, CHD-LT. This strongly suggests a connection to Charles-Henri de Latour. Whether the fabric came from a kerchief, sleeve, or cuff is unknown. But Jean preserved it, not in her desk, but inside the wax itself, fused with color and memory. Symbolically, she sealed their connection, their collaboration, into silence. During Jean's time at Vincennes, two other notable figures were housed there. François de la Mothe, a cleric accused of circulating anti-Mazarin pamphlets. Lucia de Aragona, a Spanish-born noblewoman under diplomatic protection, but whose papers were seized. Both vanished from records by 1662. No trials, no executions, just silence. Some suggest Jean was not imprisoned, but placed among others deemed volatile by knowledge rather than behavior, a holding chamber of memory. Rather than seeing Jean as a forgotten footnote or tragic recluse, we may need to reframe her entirely as a custodian of information, one chosen for her emotional precision, her loyalty, and her understanding of stillness. As someone who understood the gravity of forgetting and the cost of remembering, as one of the few who believed writing could preserve what politics erases. Of course, no story set in a castle escapes the folklore of ghosts. Modern tour guides of Vincennes will tell you about a woman in violet, seen near the south wing, appearing only in spring. They say she walks toward the writing desk in the east gallery, but when the door opens, she vanishes. Is it simply lore? Perhaps. But they also say that some visitors report the smell of burned wax and violets in that room, despite no such plants growing on the grounds. If Jean's role was truly covert, why preserve the letters at all? Why not destroy them? Was it sentiment? A failsafe? Or did she know that someone someday would find them and ask what she wasn't allowed to say aloud? In 1921, during a quiet inventory of forgotten state furniture, a modest walnut writing desk was marked for disposal. It was warped, missing one brass handle, and had been sitting in the East Gallery of Vincennes for over 100 years. One drawer, the second from the bottom, had never been opened. Its keyhole was sealed, not by rust, but by what appeared to be a thin crust of hardened wax and resin, hand-applied. Restorationists assumed it was a storage quirk. After chiseling through the seal, they found 22 folded letters in Latin and French, a sealing wax ring containing 5 blended colors, a sliver of burned silk with monogrammed initials, a small scrap of vellum, inscribed with one sentence, "Do not remember me loudly." The handwriting matched no known figures from official court records, but a faint embossed stamp on one of the letters read, J.V. This would be the only confirmed trace of Gina Lenore de Vaudemont ever found. For over 40 years, the Ministry of Culture stored the letters in a sealed archive, deemed inconclusive in historical value. Their cryptic tone, lack of political names, and emotionally veiled content left archivists uncertain how to categorize them. It wasn't until 1968, when historian Claire Duminit cross-referenced the initials of a list of unrecorded royal household members, that Jean's identity began to emerge from obscurity. What Duminit found was startling. Jean's father, François de Vaudemont, was indeed a minor noble, but had been in correspondence with Cardinal Mazarin during the Franco-Spanish peace negotiations. Jean's appointment to the Queen's household occurred just days after a Jesuit emissary from Spain arrived under diplomatic immunity. Jean never appeared again in French state papers after April 1660. Jean was never condemned. She was never publicly shamed. And that was the punishment. While loud political players of the 17th century were exiled, executed, or immortalized in satire, Jean was unwritten. Her tools were memory, language, stillness. But history demands noise, declarations, scandals, wars. Jean offered none of that. Instead, she offered a record of stillness, a commitment to preserve without exposing, to observe without betraying. Modern scholars have reframed Jean not as a prisoner, but as a living archive. Her letters were not addressed because they were not meant to travel, not signed with full names because they were not meant for official record, not destroyed because they were meant to survive, but only just in this light. Her desk becomes a time capsule, one left unsealed just long enough to let her name breathe once more. Jean's story has since inspired a 1991 novella titled The Violet Wax by Belgian writer Isabelle Wren, which fictionalizes Jean's inner thoughts as a ghost caught between lives. A stage play in 2008, The Desk That Wouldn't Open, which uses her letters as monologues of a woman watching the events of 17th century France unfold from behind a wall. A minor mention in UNESCO's 2020 paper on women archivists in European history, where Jean is cited as a rare example of someone who archived emotion rather than events. Jean's letters raise a profound question. What happens to emotional truths when the world only remembers political ones? She left behind no names, no titles, just a collection of how it felt. To be watched, to remember, to not be allowed to speak. She documented the coldness of walls, the texture of grief, the strange loyalty to someone she could not name. This was not the history of kings and battles. This was the history of silence and its unbearable weight. Letter number 22, the last of her preserved writings, ends with this. If this is found, let it not be read for scandal. Let it be known I remembered. That I did not speak loudly was not weakness. It was choice. The wax was never meant to seal, only to hold warmth a little longer. Her body was never found. Her name does not appear in any burial registry. But her words remain, unmailed, unread for centuries, and now, finally heard. Gina Lenore de Vaudemont may never be remembered with grandeur or fanfare, but she did not disappear. She chose her silence. She chose how to be remembered. And in doing so, she became a rare example of someone who archived not history, but the emotional residue it leaves behind. How many voices from the past spoke in silence? Not because they lacked power, but because they knew that some truths are too fragile to be shouted. And how many of those voices are still hidden, behind drawers, under floors, waiting only to be read softly, without spectacle? In the year 1575, a child was born in Sheffield Manor, beneath the weight of 2 crowns she never wore. Lady Arbella Stuart, granddaughter to Margaret Douglas, niece to Mary, Queen of Scots, and a distant cousin both Elizabeth I and James VI of Scotland, was born into a lineage so entangled that her very existence became a national risk. She was English, Scottish, and most dangerously of all, royal. But she was not raised in court. She was not raised to rule. Instead, her life was shaped by guardianship, surveillance, and an unspoken truth that those close to power are never truly free. To understand Arbella's story, you must first understand the fragile chessboard of 16th century succession. Elizabeth I was aging, unmarried, and childless. The question of succession remained deliberately unanswered. The Tudors were out of direct heirs. The closest relatives with strong claims? The Stuarts, through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. Enter Arbella Stuart, a girl with Tudor blood through her maternal line and Stuart blood through her paternal line. This made her a perfect compromise candidate for the English throne and a terrifying liability for those in power. From the age of 7, Arbella was placed under the care of her grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in England. Hardwicke Hall, more glass and wall, became both a palace and a prison. Arbella's days were filled with Latin lessons, needlework, theology, and above all, protocol. She was taught to write, but not to correspond freely. She was taught to speak, but not to voice opinion. She was dressed as nobility, but kept out of courtly view. She was raised like a future queen, but without a kingdom. Queen Elizabeth I never named an heir. She believed doing so would invite rebellion, undermine her reign, and open England to foreign interference. But she knew of Arbella. Everyone did. Foreign diplomats speculated on her potential. Suitors were suggested and rejected. Political factions formed around her like vines around a trellis. But Elizabeth kept Arbella neither close nor far, always on the margins, under watch. She was allowed a title, a household, and education, but not a future. Around 1592, when Arbella was in her late teens, letters began appearing in European courts, particularly those in France and Spain, proposing marriages between Arbella and Catholic princes. No one could prove who authored them, but Elizabeth's Privy Council became nervous. The very idea of Arbella marrying a foreign Catholic, without the Queen's permission, was tantamount to treason. Her grandmother was questioned. Arbella was interrogated. She denied involvement, but from that moment forward, she was never again fully trusted. In 1603, Elizabeth died. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns. He was Arbella's cousin, and many expected he would reward her loyalty by welcoming her to court. He did, briefly, but what Arbella saw at court was not inclusion. It was a choreographed exclusion. She was invited to ceremonies, but not meetings. She was praised, but not empowered. Her correspondence was monitored. Her inheritance was limited. She was a symbol of what could have been, and therefore a reminder of instability. In 1610, Arbella made a decision that would seal her fate. She secretly married William Seymour, grandson of Lady Catherine Grey, another royal claimant. This union was not political theater. It was, by all surviving letters, a genuine love match. Two people linked by blood and ambition, but driven by affection. But politically, it was a bomb. Two people with claims to the English throne, married without royal permission. Together, they formed a lineage strong enough to challenge James I, if not directly, then certainly through future heirs. James I reacted with controlled fury. He ordered the couple's separation. William was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Arbella was confined under house arrest at Lambeth, and later moved to Durham. She pleaded for mercy, not for herself, but for her husband. In her letters, she wrote, "If he be dead, I shall never marry. If he live, I shall be his, though not in sight." But her appeals fell on deaf ears. She had crossed a line no royal woman was permitted to cross, marriage by choice, not by arrangement. In June 1611, Arbella disguised herself as a man and attempted to escape to France, where she hoped to reunite with William and live freely in exile. She made it as far as Gravesend, boarding a ship disguised in cloak and hat. But her plan was uncovered. She was intercepted at sea, returned to England, and placed in the Tower, this time as a prisoner. Thus began Arbella's slow erasure. No trial, no charges, no execution, just detention, a soft silencing. She continued to write, sometimes lucidly, sometimes in emotional spirals. Her final letters speak of isolation, weakness, visions, memory slipping. I cannot see my hand in this cell without a candle. I do not know what year it is. If love be a crime, I have only ever stolen it. Why was Arbella not executed, like so many others with royal blood who acted without license? Was it mercy, or a strategy to erase her quietly, to make her into a cautionary tale for any noble woman who dared to love beyond permission? Contrary to its dark reputation, the Tower of London was not always a place of executions. By the early 1600s, it had become something far more efficient, a place of quiet punishment, a chamber for the politically inconvenient, those too noble to publicly disgrace, yet too dangerous to leave free. It was here, in a small upper room of the Queen's house, that Lady Arbella Stuart was confined in 1611, following her failed escape to France. She was not shackled. She was not tortured. She was not tried. She was simply forgotten by design. Her room measured 12 by 15 feet. It contained a writing desk, a narrow bed, a small table for meals, and a single window facing inward toward the Tower Green. The window had iron bars. Its glass was warped, and it never received direct sunlight. She was permitted a servant for meals and cleaning, but not for company. Her letters were censored, her books restricted, her ink was limited. "I may not be beaten," she once wrote, "but I am unmade." At least 11 letters survive from her Tower years, written between 1611 and 1614. They are uneven in tone, some rational and lucid, others spiraling into desperation. Letter to Sir James Croft, 1612. "You who once called me cousin, now refuse my name. Tell me, has my blood been changed in this prison?" Letter to King James I, 1613. "I never saw a crown, but only peace in the arms of one I chose. I have no son, no army, no claim but that which you assign me. Must I die for the echo of a threat I never made?" Perhaps most heartbreaking is her last known letter, dated late 1614, in which she refers to herself in the third person. She waits for pardon, though she has not begged. She waits for sunlight, though she cannot recall its warmth. She writes only because the silence weighs more than the stone. And what of William Seymour, her husband? He had been imprisoned in the Tower as well, but in a different part, the Beauchamp Tower. It is unclear whether they were ever able to communicate after their separation. In a strange twist of fate, he was released in 1613, likely due to royal pragmatism. His family had influence, and a continued imprisonment served little political purpose. But he never attempted to see Arbella again. There is no record of letters, no petition, no visit. Some say he was warned. Others say he was broken. But the silence between them became the last and cruelest form of separation. By mid-1614, Arbella's health began to collapse. Accounts describe long period without food, refusal to speak for days at a time, confusion over dates, seasons, and names, episodes of what would today be recognized as depression and dissociation. A Tower physician recorded, "Her ladyship suffers from fevers of the mind, from which neither prayer nor draught may deliver her." She began writing lines of scripture over and over again. "The Lord is my portion. The Lord is my portion." Sometimes she would write her own name dozens of times, each one smaller than the last, until it vanished entirely off the page. Lady Arbella Stuart died on September 25, 1615. The cause was recorded as decline of health. No autopsy was performed. She was 39 years old. There was no public funeral. Her body was buried in Westminster Abbey, but in an unmarked grave beneath the pavement of the south transept, near Mary Queen of Scots, the aunt she never met, whose blood marked her for power, and whose life served as a cautionary tale she could never escape. No monument, no plaque, only silence following her death. Her letters were withheld from publication. Her belongings were absorbed by the crown. Her name was excluded from genealogical rolls. Her marriage to William Seymour was officially annulled by silence, never recorded in court annals. Even historians of the time rarely mention her. She became a shadow, a footnote, a lesson, not in rebellion, but in obedience stretched too far. Arbella never raised an army. She never wrote propaganda. She never declared a claim. But she married by choice, and in that act, she reasserted her autonomy as a woman of royal blood. Her marriage combined two rival claims, the Greys and the Stuarts, creating a potential line of succession beyond James I. It wasn't her actions that doomed her. It was the potential she embodied. She was punished not for what she did, but for what others feared she might become. Today, her story is undergoing a quiet revival. In 2019, Westminster Abbey installed a small brass marker acknowledging her grave. Scholars have re-examined her letters, uncovering layers of coded language, emotion, and quiet rebellion. Feminist historians cite her as an early example of female political containment, where marriage and fertility were legislated more carefully than ambition. Visitors to the Queen's house in the Tower of London can request to see the upper chamber where Arbella was held. There is no furniture, no plaque, only a small window, still barred. Some say, on rare evenings, the room smells faintly of ink and rosewater. What became of the letters Arbella wrote and never sent? Are there still traces of her voice, hidden in attics, tucked behind chapel stones, waiting for someone to listen to a life never spoken aloud? After Arbella Stuart's death in 1615, her name quickly slipped into absence. There was no formal obituary, no court mourning, not even a royal edict marking her passing. A woman once whispered about as a possible Queen of England vanished from the record, like wax melted from a forgotten seal. And that was the point. For monarchies, memory is a political tool, and forgetting when wielded with care can be more effective than execution. Strikingly, William Seymour, Arbella's husband, thrived after her death. Freed from the Tower in 1613, he regained royal favor, inherited the Duke of Somerset title in 1660, fathered 10 children with a second wife, served as a privy councillor under Charles II. He never spoke publicly of Arbella again. There are no records of letters, eulogies, or even quiet acknowledgement. Whether out of pain, fear, or strategic survival, he let her memory vanish. The man whose bloodline merged with hers into something powerful enough to terrify a king chose to forget her. And yet, Arbella did right. She left over 30 letters that survive, scattered across archives in the British Library, the Bodleian Library, the National Archives. Most are appeals for freedom, for the right to marry, for clarity on her status. But buried within these formal petitions are moments of piercing human clarity. You may bind me from sight, but not from memory. I cannot stop being born of who I am. If I am to be punished for my name, I ask only that it be remembered in full. These are not lines of rebellion, but of self-assertion in a time when women were recorded only through their marriages and children. Arbella had neither. All she had were her words. So, why was Arbella's existence so threatening? Because her story exposed a fracture in royal power. That birthright, when coupled with autonomy, becomes dangerous. That a woman alone could choose marriage not as a tool, but as an act of love, and still alter the future of nations. In other words, she didn't play by the rules, even if she never broke the law. She married without permission. She escaped without permission. She loved without permission. And for that, she was erased, not violently, but carefully. In recent decades, Arbella's story has resurfaced through biographies like Arbella, England's Lost Queen by Sarah Griswood, historical fiction, often casting her as a tragic heroine, academic work on gender and monarchy, identify her as a symbol of suppressed succession. In 2007, a small brass memorial was finally installed in Westminster Abbey, marking her grave with her full name, no longer a whisper. Arbella was never crowned. She never ruled, but in many ways, she was royal in the truest sense, someone whose very existence required political management. Whereas male pretenders are executed, banished, or made examples of, women like Arbella were simply moved, contained, sequestered, and forgotten, not because they were weak, but because their quiet agency, their capacity to make small decisions with large consequences, pose a kind of unpredictable threat monarchies fear most. Imagine her final days. A woman in a stone cell, writing by candlelight, wearing a faded gown that once belonged to nobility, whispering to herself to remember how her name sounds when spoken kindly. She does not curse her jailers. She does not weep in her letters. She simply records, because that's what she was denied, a record of her life, told in her own hand. I have been many things, cousin, subject, threat, wife, but I have only ever claimed to be myself. Arbella joins a long list of women who were almost queens, almost wives, almost remembered. Lady Jane Grey, queen for 9 days. Catherine Howard, queen for less than 2 years. Mary Stuart, executed despite royal blood. But what sets Arbella apart is that she did not seek power. She sought peace. And that, in a world built on alliances, bloodlines, and male succession, made her even more dangerous. What does it say about power that could not allow her to live, nor allow her to die with her name intact? And how many others have been buried beneath the marble of silence? Women who wrote their own truths, only to be filed away, their words unread for centuries. By 1599, the city of Prague had become something strange, an imperial capital governed by indecision. Emperor Rudolph II, of the House of Habsburg, ruled from the sprawling Prague castle, yet preferred the company of painters, astronomers, mystics, and philosophers to generals and diplomats. He collected clocks, mechanical animals, and mirrors designed to show multiple angles of the same soul. Under his patronage, the court became a sanctuary for those who lived between disciplines, a place where ideas flourished, even if governance did not. It was here that Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer known for cataloging the stars with his naked eye, arrived to serve as imperial mathematician. And it was here, in the city's northern district, that a seldom-spoken-of figure began to appear in letters and diaries. Duchess Veronica Stepanovna Z. Lobkowicz, widow mathematician and patron of the curious. Veronica was born around 1560, the daughter of a Bohemian nobleman and a Polish merchant's granddaughter, a mix that gave her both title and tradecraft. She was married at 17 to Count Mikulas of Lobkowicz, a man 30 years her senior, known more for his debts than his influence. He died in 1583 under circumstances rarely spoken aloud. By 1590, Veronica had no surviving children, control of a modest estate, and a private library rumored to include over 400 volumes, many in Latin and Arabic. She hosted weekly salons, attended by poets, theologians, and occasionally imperial secretaries. But her interest, unusual for women of her rank, was astronomy. She owned astrolabes, a copy of Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, and 2 quadrant instruments, likely imported from Venice. And in 1599, she requested a private meeting with Tycho Brahe. Tycho was, by that time, a figure of paradox, a Danish noble exiled by his king, a scientist who rejected the Copernican model, yet disproved geocentric perfection, a man with a brass prosthetic nose, the result of a duel fought in his youth, allegedly over a mathematical equation. He came to Prague with a massive trove of notes, including decades of star observations unmatched in precision. But Tycho also arrived in Prague troubled. His position with Emperor Rudolf II was precarious. His health, never robust, had begun to decline, and his assistant, a reserved mathematician from Germany named Johannes Kepler, had started to challenge some of his conclusions. And Veronica, in Tycho's own journal, a meticulous ledger of appointments, dreams, and astronomical calculations, there is a curious entry dated March 4th, 1600, met the widow of Lobkowicz. She brings with her a clock not meant for time. The meaning is unclear, but letters preserved in the Clementum Library, then a Jesuit college, show that Veronica visited Tycho's observatory multiple times between March and July 1600. One letter, and signed but written in a woman's hand, reads, "You seek the harmony of the spheres. I seek the silence that lies between them." Was this flirtation, allegory, or genuine intellectual exchange? Between March and August 1600, Veronica and Tycho were frequently seen walking along the Rudolfinum Gardens, speaking in a mix of Latin and Czech. She challenged his hybrid planetary model, which placed Earth at the center but allowed the planets to orbit the sun, a compromise between Copernicus and tradition. She argued, gently but firmly, that science could not be bound by doctrine. He, fascinated by her intellect, began calling her the Duchess of the Fixed Stars in his notes. And yet there are no love letters, no scandalous mentions, no portraits of them together, just silence and fragments of mutual respect. In July 1600, Veronica attempted to fund a manuscript, a collaboration between Tycho and a local cartographer, aiming to create a star atlas for public use. The project never materialized. Why? Some say Kepler objected. Others say the emperor declined the funding. But in Veronica's final preserved letter, dated August 19, 1600, she writes, "Some truths belong only to silence, others to the stars. Ours is made of both." Tycho Brahe died on October 24th, 1601, allegedly from a ruptured bladder, refusing to excuse himself during an imperial banquet. Veronica did not attend the funeral. Within a year, she left Prague entirely, moving to a convent in Olomouc. There, she took no vows, but lived as a guest, teaching Latin to young novices. She died in 1613, age 53. No will, no memoirs, no official acknowledgement from the court. Her estate's library was dispersed, some volumes absorbed into Jesuit collections, others simply lost. What remains of their connection? Tycho's notebook, with repeated references to VL, a single quadrant instrument, now housed in Vienna, inscribed with the initials VSL, and one forgotten star chart, drawn in a woman's hand, mapping not constellations, but the movement of Venus over a 29-month cycle, traced like a slow dance across parchment. Was Veronica merely a noble woman fascinated by the stars, or was she a hidden contributor to a revolution in thought, too carefully erased to preserve the image of male scientific dominance? And what, exactly, was the clock not meant for time? She brought Tycho, a metaphor or a forgotten device. When Tycho Brahe died suddenly in 1601, his assistant Johannes Kepler found himself in a delicate position. Though brilliant, Kepler was young, Lutheran in a Catholic court, and politically insignificant. He had no title, no wealth, and no official patronage. But he did have something far more valuable: access to Tycho's decades of planetary data. These records, largely handwritten and partially coded, were intended for Tycho's own planetary model, a compromise that tried to preserve a fixed Earth at the center. Kepler, however, had a different vision, one that placed the sun firmly at the center of a mathematical rather than theological cosmos. And so, in the quiet winter following Tycho's death, Kepler began to study the data by candlelight and eventually published his Astronomia Nova. What went unrecorded was that some of the data had been prepared by hands other than Tycho's. Among Tycho's effects was a leather-bound notebook labeled only with the initials VSL. Inside were star positions mapped between 1597 to 1600, side margins marked with lunar cycles, and unusually, notations about atmospheric interference, dew point, and candle shadow drift, none of which were part of Tycho's standard observational method. The handwriting did not match Kepler's nor Tycho's, but it did match the script found in Veronika Stepanovna's earlier correspondence, held today in the Clementinum Library. A signature on one page read, Praeter modum V, beyond measure V. In 1612, a year before Veronika's death, Kepler wrote a short letter, now held in the Austrian State Archives, addressed to Madame L., though never sent. I have found the chart again, the one with your Venus. I did not understand your rhythm until now. You saw her dance where we saw her orbit, and in that difference, you proved the ellipse before I proved it with Mars. Had you been born under different stars, you would not have watched them. You would have changed how we see them. This remarkable line, you proved the ellipse before I proved it with Mars, suggests that Veronika had observed the elliptical pattern of Venus's motion years before Kepler formalized it. Yet she was never credited. Not in Kepler's books, not in Brahe's reports, not in the court documents. She was, it seems, buried in footnotes and drawers. Veronika's most curious artifact, however, is referenced only once, in Tycho's log. She brought the small Venus device again. It breathes by flame, not by clockwork. No device of this description has ever been recovered. The phrase breathes by flame has led to speculation among modern historians of science that she may have owned or designed a thermal expansion instrument, an early form of air thermometer or hygrometer, devices that measured atmospheric changes long before they were standardized. If true, this would make Veronika one of the earliest experimenters with weather instrumentation, and possibly the first to note how moisture and heat distort celestial observation, something Tycho often failed to account for. No patent, no diagram, only the phrase, not meant for time. After Veronika left Prague in 1601, there are no further mentions of her in court diaries, Jesuit logs, or tax rolls. Her name reappears only once, in a footnote of 1637 Jesuit inventory of religious guests in all Olmütz, as Vida L., widow, donor of volumes, speaks little. She died 12 years later, not in a house of science, but in a stone room with barred windows, writing Latin prayers for young women who would never hear her story. Her library, scattered. Her instruments, vanished. Her name, erased from science, preserved only in footnotes and in used letters. While Veronika vanished, Kepler ascended. He published the laws of planetary motion, advised imperial engineers, and laid the groundwork for Newtonian physics. Yet in 1620, in a private letter to his sister, he confessed, "Not all my stars are mine. I learned to listen to quiet minds. Not all who discover make noise." He never named her, but perhaps he didn't need to. Today, astronomers trace the movement of Venus across the sky. With advanced modeling, elliptical orbits are taught in schools. Weather stations calculate distortion with precision. And yet, the notion that a Bohemian noblewoman may have detected these variances using handmade tools, parchment, and a candle's shadow is barely a footnote. In 2013, a conference on early modern women in science included a panel on the Duchess of the Fixed Stars. It lasted 18 minutes. No one followed up. The last page of Veronika's surviving chart is not a diagram. It's a short passage in Latin written in her hand. He measured the stars as if they obeyed. I watched them to see if they hesitated. He proved them circular. I saw them hesitate, and in that moment, I loved them more. Why did Veronica choose to disappear? Or was she erased by a world not ready to see her? Did she leave instructions, a device, or simply choose the noblest fate available to her? To be a witness to history, rather than a name in its ledgers? In 1745, a Jesuit archivist cataloging manuscripts at a Clementinum library in Prague came across an ensigned star chart. It showed the movement of Venus over a 29-month synodic cycle, mapped in spirals rather than ellipses. Each loop meticulously measured against moon phases, wind notations, and room temperature. The handwriting did not match Tycho's. It did not match Kepler's. It did not match any known astronomer of the 16th century. The archivist left a note. Curious work. Appears womanly in ornament. Author unknown. Discard. The chart was placed in a box labeled Unsorted Astronomical Miscellanea. It stayed there for over 200 years. In 1998, Czech physicist Lenka Novikova, researching pre-Keplerian charts, stumbled across this same manuscript. She noticed several irregularities. The inclusion of barometric notations decades before Torricelli. The repeated annotation Praetermodum, also seen in one of Tycho Brahe's side notebooks. And a name, almost erased, pressed into the back cover. Varen, L. That year, she published an article in a niche academic journal, The Duchess of the Fixed Stars, a reconsideration of early Bohemian astronomy. It received little attention, but it offered a powerful thesis. If Veronica Stepanovna Z. Lobkowicz contributed even one correction, one calculation, or one contradiction to Tycho or Kepler's observations, then she belongs, however faintly, in the annals of science. There are many reasons Veronica's name never appeared in Kepler's or Tycho's publications. She was a noble woman, and thus not expected to publish. She was a widow with no husband to sponsor or defend her name. She was Catholic, navigating a Protestant court and post-Reformation intellectual politics. And most importantly, she was a woman working in science without permission, license, or institutional cover. Even her possible contributions would have been viewed as illegitimate, if not dangerous. Veronica's final years in the All-Almost convent are largely undocumented. She taught Latin. She copied theological texts. And, according to a single surviving letter by a fellow resident, she spoke often of the sky and little of herself. She died in 1613, buried beneath a chapel stone with no epitaph. Her instruments were likely dismantled or sold. The thermal device she showed Tycho, the clock not meant for time, was never recovered. Her work was never published. Her name appears in no formal proceedings of the imperial mathematicians. Her only confirmed legacy, marginalia in a book of Copernicus, 2 preserved letters written in a firm, elegant Latin, a quadrant inscribed with her initials, and a memory of a star chart drawn with attention to the flaw's imperfection. In a fragmented page found near the end of Tycho Brahe's private journal, dated only October 1601, there is one final reference. She said, "The stars of souls because we give them names." I disagreed, but now I am unsure. This line is unlike anything else in the journal, typically dry and mathematical. It suggests that Veronica left more than data behind. She left doubt, the philosopher's seed of discovery. Today, an unnamed lunar crater near the southern limb is unofficially referred to by Czech astronomers as Veronica's Circle. There is a quiet movement to name it formally, not because she changed the course of astronomy, but because she touched it invisibly, irrevocably. The historian's temptation is always to ask, why didn't she publish? Why didn't she fight harder to be seen? But perhaps the better question is this. Why must we assume she failed to make her mark? Simply because we fail to remember her. Perhaps some orbits were never meant to pass through fame, but to quietly alter the paths of those who did. Built in the 13th century, Castello di Montebello was never meant to be a grand palace. It was a watchtower, expanded over centuries into a fortress home, passing between local nobles and condottieri as war and inheritance demanded. Its architecture is practical. Narrow staircases to slow invaders, slit windows for archers, and a central courtyard ringed by uneven cobblestones. constantly slick from mountain mist. But what is most known for, though rarely discussed in tourist brochures, is the legend of Azarina. And unlike most legends, this one is documented in the Archivio Storico di Rimini. There is a parchment written in 1620, catalogued by a monk named Fra Bartolomeo. It is not a tale of miracles or saints, but of a missing child and the eerie details surrounding her final hours. The child's name, Gendolina Malatesta. Her nickname, Azarina, Little Blue One. Born in 1370, she was a daughter of Ugolino Malatesta, a minor lord of a minor castle, living in a time of bubonic plague, fractured papal politics, and endless border skirmishes. She was born albino, pale skin, white hair, pale eyes. But according to Fra Bartolomeo's manuscript, her eyes were of indigo shade, impossible to define. Her parents, ashamed of superstition in their court, dyed her hair with herbal indigo paste to hide the albinism. This gave rise to the nickname and to the whispers. Gendolina was not allowed to play outside the castle walls. She was kept indoors, seen by few, and assigned 2 armed guards to accompany her always, not for protection against enemies, but from herself. The castle's priest declared her born beneath a sorrowed star, referencing her affliction as a divine curse. Her mother, whose name is never recorded, insisted she be taught Latin prayers, believing piety would cleanse her. And so, the child learned to read long before she learned to run. She wrote in margins. She sang hymns under her breath. And most curiously, she spoke off in the corners, as though someone were there. The servants believed she was simply imaginative. The guards were not so sure. In the center of Montebello's courtyard was a covered stone well, its bucket long removed, sealed for decades by a circular iron grate. Gendolina was told never to touch it. It was old, dangerous. But according to Fra Bartolomeo's notes, she became obsessed with it around age 6. She asked, "What is a dream about?" She whispered into its mouth, "Do you remember the rain?" One guard, unnamed, claimed she sat by for hours, sketching shapes into dust. One resembled a crescent surrounding it, an old Etruscan symbol for the veiled promise. The date is recorded precisely. It was a summer solstice, a day when, according to local superstition, vows made aloud become binding. That afternoon, a storm approached. Gendolina was playing with a cloth doll near the courtyard well, supervised by her 2 guards, who stood under the covered archway. Lightning struck nearby. The sky darkened rapidly. According to the guard's testimony, preserved in Fra Bartolomeo's document, Gendolina ran toward the well, not out of fear, but with intention. She said aloud, "I promise not to leave. I promise I'll stay. Don't forget me." Then she vanished. No scream, no sound, no body. Only the doll lying near the grate. The well was searched the next day. No trace of her was found. The water was shallow. The grate rusted but intact. The priest declared a divine reclamation. Her father declared a curse broken. The well was sealed with a copper plate, etched with a single phrase, "Silenziata ma non sparita." Silence, but not gone. It remains sealed to this day. For centuries, servants in the castle refused to enter the courtyard at night. Some claimed to hear soft humming, laughter in the rain, or whispers echoing from the well's edge. In the 1800s, the castle was converted to a military outpost. A general's wife recorded in her journal, "The courtyard is colder than the rest. My daughter claims a white girl sings when it rains." I cannot tell if this is a child's game or something older. In 1989, an Italian radio crew conducted a recording session at the well on the summer solstice. The broadcast was uneventful until they reviewed the tapes. They claimed to hear a faint child's voice say, "You promised." The audio has never been authenticated. What remains striking is not the child's disappearance, but her final words, "I promise not to leave. I promise I'll stay." What does it mean for a child to vow not to vanish, only to do so moments later? What was she speaking to? Or who? Was it a spirit? A grief? A prophecy? Or was the well not a prison, but a portal of memory? If the well did not take her, if it only listened, then where did Gendolina go? And what exactly was it that she promised to remain for her? A place, a person, or a memory? After Gendalina Malatesta's disappearance in 1375, the 2 guards assigned to her were detained. Their names are listed, though spelled variously, as Luca Benetti and Giorgio della Scala. According to the trial record, kept by the local priory, their testimonies were nearly identical. Gendalina was playing. She approached the well. She made a verbal promise. A flash of light or thunder occurred, unclear in the record. When they looked again, she was gone. They denied harming her. They denied moving from their posts. No charges were ultimately brought. The court's final statement was curious. The event occurred without precedent or explanation. Let it not be pursued further. The statement was signed by Bishop Anselmo della Rovere and sealed with a black wax mark, the ecclesiastical symbol for closed judgment. No further investigation was ever ordered. The most complete account of Azzarina comes from a 17th century Benedictine monk named Fra Bartolomeo del Silenzio, who was assigned to Montebello region during plague recovery efforts. His notes, preserved in the Archivio Storico di Rimini, span 16 handwritten pages and contain interviews with aging castle residents, scattered family letters, and local superstitions. He summarizes Azzarina's case this way. She was a child of isolation, born without guilt and made into myth by fear. Her vow was not to escape, but to remain, and in so remaining became part of the stone itself. He also includes an intriguing theological speculation. If prayers reach heaven, perhaps vows descend into places where memory is heavier than the soul. Over the centuries, Azzarina's story did not fade. It evolved. In the 1400s, castle workers would leave small gifts, toys, ribbons, or folded paper cranes near the sealed well to keep the child from wandering. In the 1500s, a midwife visiting Montebello claimed that a pale girl appeared to her in a dream and told her, "The rain is mine now." By the 1800s, local school children were warned not to lie near running water, lest Azzarina call her by name during storms. These weren't ghost stories told for amusement. They were instructions, quiet ones, whispers passed down like weather reports from another century. Montebello's caretakers recorded several odd meteorological events tied to June 21st, the date of Gendalina's disappearance. In 1836, during a heat wave, a sudden hailstorm struck only the castle hill, destroying the vegetable gardens while sparing the lower village. In 1907, visitors reported ice forming on the grate of the well despite 30 degrees Celsius weather. In 1961, lightning struck the same tower twice within minutes, both times during a solstice audio recording session. To this day, a chill in the courtyard air around the well is often noted in guest books, recorded not with drama, but with puzzled calm. The most publicized incident surrounding Azzarina occurred in June 1989, when an Italian RAI-affiliated radio team visited Montebello to record ambient sounds for a documentary on castle acoustics. They left a condenser microphone above the well for an uninterrupted 8-hour night cycle, intending to capture echoes, bird song, and wind modulation through stone. The final 30 seconds of the tape, played back in studio, included a faint, high-pitched melody, seemingly from a child, a whisper unintelligible, and just before the tape ended, a girl's voice. "Hi, Gerardo. You swore." The technicians, religious or not, refused to sleep in the castle the next night. The original tape was preserved, analyzed by skeptics and believers alike. No clear conclusion has been drawn. Among the few physical traces left by Azzarina is a single carved symbol rediscovered during a 1973 restoration of a storage room near the courtyard. It was etched into the underside of a wooden beam, barely visible, in the exact shape recorded by Fra Bartolomeo, a crescent moon cradling a dot, with a faint crossbar through the center. Archaeologists confirmed the symbol's Etruscan origin associated with oaths taken in silence, or spoken grief without reply. It was used in rural grave markers as far back as 400 BCE. What was doing in a medieval Italian castle, drawn by a child, remains unknown. Today, Montebello's caretakers are cautious when discussing Azzarina. No official tours focus on her. No signage marks the well. Guests who ask are gently redirected. And yet, on solstice nights, someone always leaves a doll or ribbon near the courtyard. In visitor logbooks, the same line appears more than once. It felt like someone remembered me before I arrived. If a child's promise can anchor across centuries, what does that say about the nature of memory in place? And can sorrow, spoken once with conviction, truly settle into stone, not as a ghost, but as a quiet architecture of presence? Many castles are remembered for battles, betrayals, or kings who once slept within their halls. Castello di Montebello, by contrast, is remembered for what was lost, not what was kept. There are no paintings of Gandalina, no preserved belongings, not even a headstone, and yet her absence is structurally present. The well remains sealed, the courtyard remains undecorated, and the summer solstice remains a day when no official events are scheduled, though no one states why. Montebello remembers by design and through avoidance. In 2003, restoration architects reviewing Montebello's structure made a curious discovery. The courtyard stones directly surrounding the well are newer than those at the center, suggesting they were replaced or rearranged long after the original construction. But why? There are no recorded renovations, no practical reason, only a local tradition, passed down through 3 generations of caretakers. Do not walk the circle around the well on June 21st. The stone remembers her shape. Some believe this was ritual. Others say it's simply folklore. But either way, the perimeter is never breached on that night. Even now, though never part of official Italian history, Azzurina has left footprints in unexpected places. A 1984 children's book called The Indigo Child was loosely inspired by her story, using a fictionalized setting. A musical composition for solo violin titled Silenzio in Pietra, Silence in Stone, was performed in Montebello in 2011, with the final note held over an actual field recording from the well. And a 2021 journal article in Cultural Psychology explored how collective silence, when repeated over generations, becomes a form of living memory, with Montebello as its case study. Azzurina has become something rare, a non-person, preserved not through historical documentation, but through ritual behaviors that resist forgetting. Despite centuries of searching and speculation, no remains were ever found. Theories abound. Accidental fall through a structural gap, deliberate concealment by frightened guards, natural disappearance through underground passages. But none explain the lack of distress recorded by her parents after her vanishing. If anything, her father's only quote, preserved by Fra Bartolomeo, is chilling in its attachment. She made a vow, let the stone keep it. Was it grief, denial, or belief in something deeper, something more enduring than answers? In certain early Christian sects, there existed a quiet doctrine called the prayerless saint, one who does not intercede but remains, offering not blessing or punishment but presence. It was believed such figures could be children, would never be canonized, and would anchor sacred memory in a place simply by never leaving. Azzurina may not be a ghost. She may be a memory artifact, imprinted not through vengeance or unfinished business, but through a promise repeated enough times to gain weight. She said, "I promise I'll stay." And she did. In 2006, a 12-year-old visitor reportedly saw a girl in white standing at the far end of the courtyard during a summer thunderstorm. She vanished. The parents thought it was imagination until they checked the courtyard camera later and saw a single frame with a blur shaped like a child close to the sealed well. No publicity followed. The family asked for the footage not to be shared. They simply wrote in the guest book, "We did not expect to feel remembered." What if Azzurina's story was not about haunting, but about the cost of promising too much, too young? What if her vow to never leave was not a prophecy or curse, but the echo of a child desperate to belong, to matter, to be kept? And what if the stone took her at her word? What if we do not see her because she has kept her promise too well? Montebello remains quiet, not out of disuse, but out of reverence. Children do not run in the courtyard. Tour guides lower their voices near the well. And every June 21st, someone no one knows who places a blue ribbon on the grate. It is gone by morning. Always, What does it mean to become part of a place? Not by history, but by vow. And if a child's whispered promise can anchor across centuries, what other voices have we mistaken for silence, when all along they were only waiting to be heard by someone willing to listen softly? In the early 14th century, the region stretching from Catalonia to Languedoc was a maze of overlapping jurisdictions. Spanish crowns ruled some valleys. French lords claimed others. Monasteries held roads hostage with tolls. And local families, especially those with trading caravans, controlled the flow of goods, gold, and gossip. It was here, in the border town of La Jonquera, that a girl named Isabel de Arriaga was last seen under her true name. She was 14 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. She spoke both Catalan and Occitan. She was literate. She traveled with no dowry and no parents. And by spring of 1317, she had become a diplomatic inconvenience. The details come from two sources, discovered centuries apart. A merchant's ledger found in Girona, noting a payment made for escort of noble cargo, human, female. March 1317. A convent's confession book in Narbonne, which includes a fragmented, anonymous entry. She wore the blue of one kingdom and the veil of another. They said she was promised, but she had promised herself elsewhere. What we now believe. Isabel was betrothed to a French noble, but had already secretly married a Catalan merchant's son, possibly by mutual oath only, no church, no witnesses. This union was not political. It was personal, and it was illegal. When the matchmakers, likely from the de Montfort family, discovered Isabel's defiance, she was declared contracted in absentia to a different man, Gerard de Beau, a minor baron aligned with the French crown. But Isabel, aided by her nursemaid and 3 merchants with allegiances to her Catalan lover's family, was smuggled north, not in bridal finery, but in the back of a linen cart, beneath bolts of dyed cloth and dried lavender. The route was deliberate, from La Jonquera, through Camperdon, over the Col d'Ieres Pass, and down into Arles-sur-Tech, a town known for its unmonitored abbey roads. Her name was changed to Sabot, and later Nuria. Every stop along the way erased part of her. The smuggling failed in Cerdagne at the hands of a local magistrate who had ties to the French side. By now, Isabel was traveling alone, her escort having separated to draw attention, carrying only a velvet satchel with letters, now lost, wearing a ring with the seal of the Arriaga family, identifying her nobility. She was arrested not as a criminal, but as a fugitive bride. Her captors recorded her as one who confuses loyalty with affection, one whose station must be corrected. She was not returned to her parents. Instead, she was placed in protective custody, a euphemism for noble detainment, in a Benedictine priory near Carcassonne. The priory of Saint Michel de Caberspine was isolated, ringed by cliffs and cypress trees, with no formal road access in wet seasons. Here, Isabel was given a new name, Sir Beatrice, made to wear monastic blue, forbidden from writing letters without approval. But unlike other noble girls hidden in cloisters, Isabel did not resist the silence. According to the priory's confession book, she volunteered in the gardens, repaired vestments with needlework, kept a private journal in the margins of a psalter, now lost except for one surviving page. I was meant to belong, but I chose to witness. I cannot unlove, but I can outlive. 3 letters addressed to Don Hugo de Arriaga, her original lover, were later discovered sewn into the hem of a donated altar cloth, sold during a priory fundraiser in the late 15th century. They are undated, but written in her hand. One reads, "You will not find me where I was. I do not wish you to, not because I've forgotten, but because I remember without need." Another, "Tell our daughters, the ones we never had, to listen to water. It never lies." The third, "This road does not end in marriage, but in peace. And that is a better victory." Isabel, or Sir Beatrice, never returned to Catalonia. She took no vows. She died in 1342, aged 39, from unknown causes. Her burial record notes her only as the sister who chose her name. Her grave is unmarked. Was Isabel truly smuggled for love, or was she simply seeking a way to become her own author in a story where noble women were written by others? And if so, did she succeed, not by escaping, but by refusing to vanish into the life assigned to her? Isabel's escape in 1317 caused not only personal embarrassment, but a small political crisis in the borderlands. The intended marriage between Isabel and Gerard de Beau was part of a truce effort between the Aragonese crown and Gascon baronies, meant to legitimize cross-border trade, and expected to pacify the rogue customs houses between Narbonne and Figueres. Her disappearance and rumored defection to a Catalan merchant son undermined a year of negotiations. Within weeks, trade tariffs were reimposed. Road guards were tripled. Several merchant families were questioned and some expelled. One account from a tax log in Perpignan simply says, "The girl cost the season's peace." A remarkable line, and one that illustrates the outsized role women played in diplomacy even when they weren't allowed to speak in council. Despite Isabel's disappearance and the ensuing regional tensions, the Arriaga family made no formal claim or public demand. This has led historians to speculate they may have agreed to her exile to avoid scandal, or viewed her retreat into religious life as an acceptable political solution. What's notable is that her name was expunged from family records. She is not listed among the Arriaga daughters in any genealogical manuscript after 1318. However, in a personal prayer book belonging to Isabel's younger sister, Ines, a note is written in the inner margin. Beatrice lives like the Virgin, hidden, unclaimed, without bitterness. Within a generation, Isabel's story had entered merchant folklore, particularly among linen traders and muleteers. She became known not as a runaway bride, but as La Novice in Nombre, the bride without a name. Common phrases in letters and journals include, "May our cargo pass like hers, light and unseen. We travel with no banners, like the Novia did. Promise nothing on mountain roads." Even she was caught in spring. For a time, smugglers used Beatrice as a code word for discreet deliveries. One Beatrice, southbound 3 nights. It meant human cargo untraceable, escorted quietly. Whether she intended it or not, Isabel had become a symbol of passage, of female autonomy, of hidden choice, of movement without violence. Even after her death, Sir Beatrice continued to appear in cloister logs, not in detail, but as a quiet reference. In 1351, a novice at the Abbey of St. Saturnin wrote, "We have no portraits of her, but they say she always mended with gold thread, even when the fabric did not ask for it." Another entry from 1376 describes a stone bench in the convent garden still called La Place de Beatrice. No one sat on it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The most tantalizing physical link to Isabel is a psalter annotated in multiple inks, with marginalia in Occitan and Latin, now housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Among the marginal notes are phrases like, "To love once is enough. Let the marriage be remembered, even if never recognized. I did not break the law. I refused the script." A note in 16th century handwriting on the flyleaf identifies the writer only as Beda A, recluse of Saint Michel, daughter of a forgotten cause. There is no confirmed likeness of Isabel, no illuminated manuscript, no signature, but in a 15th century convent embroidery, depicting a line of cloistered saints and known holy women, there is one figure with no face. Above her head is a line of text in thread. For her who walked back from the altar toward herself. The convent records do not name her, but the local oral tradition does. In modern-day Catalonia and Languedoc, the story of La Novice in Nombre continues in subtle ways. A popular girl's lullaby ends with the line, "Let her choose her name like Beatrice." In Girona, a narrow alleyway between 2 shuttered buildings is still called El Carré de la Novia, marked only with a faded etching of a ring and a broken line. And in an annual blessing of merchant caravans, one card is symbolically left unmarked, in honor of the unspoken cargo of peace. Did Isabel flee because of love, or because she foresaw a future written in ink not her own? And in choosing silence over spectacle, did she, in the end, wield the only power noble women were ever truly allowed, the ability to vanish on their own terms. When Sir Beatrice died in 1342, there was no funeral procession. Her passing is recorded only in the convent ledger with a line that reads, "She left with no enemy." This was not common phrasing. Most entries reference virtue, vows, or cause of death. But hers? A description of her departure in a language of non-conflict, as if the only achievement that could be named was that she had not disturbed the world around her. And yet she had, not with rebellion, not with seduction, but with her absence. By the 1400s, Beatrice had become a coded name among nuns, seamstresses, and traveling merchants in the region. It signified a woman whose history wasn't to be asked for, a name chosen, not inherited, a traveler whose silence was to be honored. In one tailor's notebook from Perpignan, the word Beatrice appears not as a name, but as a notation beside a certain stitch pattern. For lining secret folds, Beatrice. Even caravans refer to unregistered female passengers as a Beatrice, meaning, do not ask, escort with care. She had become a signifier, not of scandal, but of escape that refused drama, of deliberate erasure that left a soft but permanent dent in the structure of obedience. The 3 unsent letters, found sewn into the hem of a convent altar cloth centuries later, were never meant for mail. They were a ritual. The stitches were tiny, deliberate in color with a pale green thread, a shade linked in convent coding, with hope unspoken aloud. The last of the 3 letters ends with, "If your name survives, let it survive as a whisper. I would not trade mine for a title." The historian who discovered them wrote, "She was not lost. She left. The fabric carried her better than a tombstone would have." In 17th century monastic records from southern France, a term appears that scholars once believed to be symbolic, Beatrician silence. It refers to the right of a woman to withhold her true name upon entering a cloister, to relinquish her family title, and to be known only by the duties she performed, not her blood. This doctrine is never traced to Rome, nor to any male theologian. Its origin is only ever footnoted as a woman who crossed the border and unspoke her lineage. In the gardens of St. Michel de Caberspine, where Beatrice lived her final decades, a small stone rests upright, unmarked but routinely cleared of weeds. It is never named in tourist materials, but locals know it. Each spring, an anonymous visitor leaves a linen ribbon, sewn with 3 simple stitches, always the same pattern, always folded once, as if waiting to be sewn again. Today, Isabel's story, half-truth, half-preserved rumor, lives on, in oral traditions among weavers and seamstresses, in feminist essays about unnaming as a form of autonomy, and in the quiet blessings still whispered in parts of the Pyrenees. May you choose your hemline. May your name be yours. In many ways, she has become a patron saint of thresholds, of women between lives, between borders, between titles. Not powerful, not martyred, not canonized, just deliberate. Isabel de Arriaga did not change dynasties. She did not publish letters. She did not rule, but she changed her name. And in doing so, she changed the shape of how memory can survive when it has no sanctioned space. She did not demand a legacy. She stitched one into hems, into silence, into movement. What if the truest kind of rebellion is not shouting, but stepping out of view, not to disappear, but to belong only to oneself? And how many women, erased from ledgers and lineage, are still traveling through history, sewn into seams, slipped between pages, waiting only to be found not as figures, but as intentions? Built in the 1420s and fortified under King Frederick II, Kronborg Castle controlled the narrowest point of the Øresund, the shipping lane between Denmark and Sweden. Every ship that passed was taxed, watched, and counted. Kronborg was both a symbol of Danish sovereignty and a trapdoor through which thousands of foreign mariners and merchant crews were detained, questioned, or drafted into temporary service. Its cold stone walls held not just cannons and archives, but quiet prisons, an armory, and a royal chapel, rebuilt after fire in 1629. But some parts of the castle, especially the subcrypt beneath the chapel, remained off limits. even officers. In the winter of 1644, during the Torstenson War between Denmark and Sweden, a Danish naval officer named Captain Mads Enevoldsen returned to Kronborg from a brief campaign along the Baltic coast. He was 38 years old, had served in the Royal Navy since his teens, and had no noble title, but earned respect for his stoic leadership and precise navigation. He was expected to leave again in 2 weeks. Instead, he vanished. There was no death notice, no funeral, just a single entry in the officer's logbook. Enevoldsen relieved of duty. Private matter, not for record. His wife, Signa Enevoldsen, had traveled with him to Kronborg, an unusual arrangement. They had no children. She kept no formal title, but she had, by all accounts, followed her husband's deployments for years. After his disappearance, she remained in the castle. For 3 months, she was given lodging in a disused wing, allowed to walk to chapel, but forbidden from speaking to the garrison. Why was she not sent away? Why was she allowed to stay at all? There is no explanation in the records, only a note in the quartermaster's log. Leave her meals. Do not ask her name. She is owed. In May of 1645, a marble cross-shaped slab appeared in the lowest chamber of the chapel crypt, a space not open to the public, nor listed in the official architectural plans. The stone bore no name, no coat of arms, no epitaph, just a faintly scratched compass rose pointing east. An anonymous carpenter's receipt exists, noting, "Stone laid for silence." No chisel, no trumpet. It was paid for in coin, with no signature. Shortly after, Signa Enevoldsen was gone. She left no letter, no property, no trace. Only a black shawl hung neatly on the chapel pew. In letters sent between soldiers stationed at Kronborg in 1645, the following phrases appear. The captain's widow walks the crypt. She sings at the east wall, where no sound echoes. Her lamp never burned oil. It burned waiting. One corporal, later court-martial for desertion, claimed, "She spoke to someone beneath the stone, not aloud, with her hands." Another, in a letter to his wife, wrote, "The marble cross chills the whole chapel, though no wind touches it." Centuries passed. Chapel renovations in 1781, 1842, and 1927 each made minor changes to the crypt, but none removed the marble cross. Curators debated whether it was a cenotaph, a misplaced relic, or a prank by an unknown mason. Yet, no one has successfully moved the stone. It is not listed in Kronborg's official catalog of artifacts. And no floor plans include the sub-crypt chamber, not until an accidental rediscovery in 1974, when a historian noticed a discrepancy in echo length beneath the chapel. When workers reopened the room, they found a dry space, lined with bricks blackened by age, and at the center, the same marble cross, faintly glowing with condensation. Captain Mads Enevoldsen's service file ends abruptly in 1644. Signa Enevoldsen appears in no parish record, no burial list, no estate ledger. They left nothing behind, except for a stone with no name, and a compass etched by hand, pointing to a sea he never returned from. Did Signa bury her husband, or only the memory of him? And is a marble cross beneath Kronborg a grave, or a map drawn in stone, waiting for someone to understand its direction? When Kronborg's chapel crypt was refurbished in 1781, engineers documented the standard foundation chambers, limestone blocks, utility alcoves, and drainage wells. But the subcrypt, a single octagonal chamber beneath the east wall, was not mapped. In fact, only one workman, a mason named Eric Mork, mentioned at all in a personal notebook found centuries later. His entry reads, "The marble slab was already there. I do not know who placed it. I do not know who it honors. But the dust does not rest on it." He also noted that tools placed on the stone overnight appeared damp in the morning, though the rest of the room remained dry. When he asked the chaplain about it, he was told simply, some stones were not meant to be walked on again. During the brief 3-month period in 1645, when Signa Enevoldsen remained at Kronborg, several unusual behaviors were recorded by guards and junior officers. She descended to the crypt each evening at the same hour. She carried no candle. She never opened her mouth while walking. Her shawl, dark wool unembroidered, was always folded twice and placed on the same pew. The steward's log mentions, Lady E takes no food on Sundays, requests no reading materials, speaks to no one, requests only stillness. One guard, in a disciplinary statement after refusing post duty, wrote, "She does not cry. That is what unsettles me. There is no grief, only rehearsed return." In 1927, during a routine cleaning of the subcrypt, a junior curator named Emily Holmgren noticed a tiny engraving on the underside of the slab's western edge. A compass rose, yes, but now accompanied by a second mark, a small loop figure eight, bisected by a short vertical line. Historians could not place the origin of the mark, but one antiquarian noted that the symbol resembled an older Norse bind rune, sometimes interpreted as return not demanded, or alternatively, keep safe the lost. This bind rune does not appear anywhere else in the castle. In 1974, an acoustic engineer named Ole Bergstrand was commissioned to map echo ranges for a planned concert series in Kronborg's chapel. His report, now archived, makes a passing note. Area beneath eastern transept registers unusual dampening, despite stone consistency, suggests hollow space below or unusual floor composition. When engineers re-examined the area, they rediscovered the subcrypt, previously blocked by a sealed lintel. Inside, the marble cross was untouched, surrounded by fine white dust, but none settled on the stone, and centered perfectly within a space where sound dropped by 40% compared to the rest of the room. It was, acoustically speaking, a chamber of intentional quiet. Though the cross bears no name, it has received regular, anonymous offerings since at least the 1800s. A brass compass, 1901, placed directly atop the stone, later stolen, never recovered. A press letter, written in Danish and found under the slab's edge in 1933. I could not follow him, so I followed her. Let the stone remember us both. A single black glove, discovered in 2008 during a humidity inspection. No prints, no accompanying note. No records explain who leaves these things. But they appear only between late April and early May, the same period Signa stayed in Kronborg in 1645. Curators have tried photographing the slab over time. In every image, the stone surface reflects light differently, even under identical conditions. Infrared scans show no heat signatures. LiDAR shows no hollow chamber beneath. Still, the marble cross behaves as though it is being touched despite no human interaction, and always, the compass rose remains visible, pointing east. Theories range widely that Captain Enevoldsen died in service and was secretly interred due to political reasons, that he deserted, and his wife laid a stone as symbolic forgiveness, that Signa herself died, and someone else, an officer, a chaplain, placed a stone in her name. But most agree on this. The stone is not a grave. It is a record of refusal. It records the refusal to forget, the refusal to explain, the refusal to grieve aloud. It is not dramatic. It is committed. Did Signa lay the marble cross for a man she lost, or for herself, as a way to remain within stone long after her name was erased? And can grief, held silently long enough, reshape the very room that contains it? Though Kronborg Castle has hosted monarchs, soldiers, prisoners, and tourists, few have ever been formally told the story of the marble cross. And yet, quiet practices persist. Guards on night duty in the eastern wing do not whistle or hum, as per unwritten tradition. When musicians rehearse in the chapel, they are instructed not to tune their instruments facing the east wall. Tour groups are never scheduled near the crypt after sundown, though no official rule states this. One Danish tour coordinator explained, "We don't tell people the story, but the castle remembers it for us. It's easier that way." In 1996, a guest book near the lower chapel contained a single-page comment. "We did not know why we came, but the silence told us who had stayed." The same phrase or slight variations have reappeared every decade since, in English, Danish, and German. Visitors who discover the subcrypt often do not speak for several minutes afterward. Even children lower their voices. The room is not labeled on any current maps, but the marble cross is still there, untouched, unpolished, but strangely clean. What makes this story unusual is its lack of resolution. There is no confirmed death, no body, no poem, no myth. Instead, there's a space cut into the heart of a military fortress. That became a form of consented mourning. Grief was not buried here. It was housed. It was made architectural, like insulation, like breath in cold stone. Why east? East is where the sun rises, yes. East is also the direction of naval departure from Danish ports. But east, in certain maritime rituals, is also the direction used in lost sailor ceremonies, when a body is never returned from sea. Perhaps Signa knew her husband had died. Perhaps she only believed it. But the compass rose was not a memorial to where he was. It was a gesture toward where he had gone, and she faced it daily for 3 months, then vanished. There is no word in Danish for a widow that disappeared. No specific title for a woman whose love is neither living nor buried. No name for the act of grieving, without evidence. Signa Enevoldsen became, in the castle's memory, not a widow, but a resident of absence. She occupied a pew, a crypt, a period of time unrecorded by state or church. But the place held her shape like sand after footprint. Stone is not subtle. It is chosen, carved, laid. That the marble cross was, and signed, unblessed, unlisted, is a kind of communication in itself. It says, "This grief is not yours to interpret. It belongs to no one but the one who placed it." Since 2015, visitors who find the crypt often leave. A single coin placed flat on the marble, a small compass keyring left facing the east wall, or, most commonly, a strip of black ribbon folded once and not tied. None of these gestures are official. They are learned, not through instruction, but through imitation of reverence. The space teaches people how to behave in it. We are accustomed to mourning as a performance, with weeping, naming, carving, storytelling. But what happens when mourning removes itself from all of these? What if the truest, longest-lasting expression of love is to build a space and refuse to fill it with words? Signa did not cry. She did not mark. She did not speak. She simply stayed until she was done. And in doing so, she turned grief into a room and memory into atmosphere. Now, Kronborg Castle carries her, not as legend, but as a silence woven into its structure. If silence is the most faithful kind of remembrance, then what else might we have forgotten to listen to? And how many rooms across history have already told their stories, not in writing, but in the refusal to echo? By the mid-1200s, Fort St. Leon was no longer a military site. After a brief role in the Albigensian Crusade, it was quietly repurposed by the bishopric of Poitiers into a retreat for disobedient women of rank. Not a convent, not a prison, something in between. Here they sent widows who refused second marriages, unwed mothers of noble birth, daughters who defied matches or were suspected of heresy. The fortress became known as a place of silence, needlework, and correction. No vows were taken, but no one left unless a bishop or husband demanded it. In 1297, a new arrival was delivered under knight escort, a covered carriage with no heraldry, accompanied by 2 Franciscan friars. She was listed in the Priory's Gate book as unknown woman, age between 20 and 30, no confession, no sponsor. She spoke perfect Latin, wore no jewelry, carried only a small cloth bag, later found to contain ashes, with a silver pendant buried within. She refused to give a name. When asked what she should be called, she replied, "Give me the color you fear." They call her Sir Noir, the Black Sister. Sir Noir did not speak for her first 7 weeks. She was assigned a small stone cell, south-facing, with a wooden cot, no desk, and 1 carved cross in the wall. Her days were spent in the garden, unmoving, her hands folded, even when idle, her meals barely touched. And yet she was watched constantly, because she was never ill. She was never penitent. She was, according to monks, already finished. 3 months after her arrival, a priest visited to deliver a sermon. Afterward, he noticed that a bundle of altar linen, freshly embroidered for Lent, had been disassembled and restitched, not with symbols of the Passion, but with a single continuous black thread, forming a spiral. The cloth was traced to Sir Noir. She offered no explanation. She was confined to her cell for a week. When her cot was inspected, it revealed a pattern of charred dots, forming a crude constellation burned into the wood. It matched no known star map, but it did match the alignment of the abbey's bells, hung above her cell. In 1300, a man arrived asking for her. His name is not recorded. He wore green, not noble colors, and spoke Italian accented French. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, the bell tower rang 3 times, though no one pulled a rope. That evening, Sir Noir was found, kneeling, unmoved, her lips burnt, as if she had whispered over fire. No record exists of what was said. The visitor was never seen again. In 1301, a monk cleaning the walls of her cell discovered a strange carving behind the hanging cross. An eye, half-lidded, etched into stone, with 7 lines fanning outward, each line ending in a drop shape. The carving was not there when she arrived. It was too deep to be done by hand, yet no tools had been issued to her. When asked about it, she finally spoke. Every drop is a word that was not forgiven. She did not speak again for another year. In 1302, during a lightning storm, a stone fell from the chapel tower, collapsing part of the cloister wall. Sir Noir's cell was unharmed, but the priory decided to seal the southern wing. All women were relocated, but she refused to move. One record notes, she said her cell was already a vow. The abbess, unable to force her, conceded. The south wing was closed around her. She became the only occupant of that part of the fort. She was not spoken to again. In 1303, a monk passing into the garden heard a single line sung aloud, in a woman's voice unmistakably hers. The bells do not call the living. They remember the vanished. When he returned to the cell, she was not there. Her cot was made. Her cloth bag was gone. The cell door, once warped and noisy, was found closed, silent, and locked from the inside. There was no key. Was Sir Noir a woman punished for silence, or a woman who turned silence into her sanctuary? And if so, was she ever alone in that cell, or simply becoming the room itself, one unanswered word at a time? When Sir Noir vanished from her locked cell in 1303, no formal investigation followed. The abbess recorded it with only this line: her absence is her decision. The room will speak for her. No ceremony was held. No search party dispatched. Her few belongings, cloth, ashes, the silver pendant, were never found. The door was bricked over 3 days later, but not because of fear, because of respect. The entire southern wing of Fort St. Lien, 6 cells, 2 stairwells, and a cloister garden, was left abandoned after her disappearance. Not deconsecrated, not demolished, just left untouched. Subsequent abbesses referred to it as La Voûte Noire, the Black Vault. By the 1400s, its existence was no longer marked on internal monastery maps. Though the corridor remained structurally sound, it was treated as a kind of architectural absence, a kept silence. In 1679, a bishop visiting from Angoulême requested the room be reopened for inspection. A mason was brought. The bricks were cleared, but inside, the room was bone dry, despite moisture in all other cells. A thin layer of black ash covered the floor, perfectly undisturbed. The carved eye with 7 drops remained on the stone. When the mason swept the ash, he claimed to hear a woman exhale near the ceiling. No one else heard it. Still, the bishop revoked the reopening. The cell was sealed again, this time with lime and prayer. In 1922, during an archaeological survey, the southern wing was rediscovered by accident when a support wall cracked during restoration. The cell once assigned to Sir Noir was still intact. Inside, the cot had no rot or damage, unlike others in the complex. The window grate had no rust, though nearby iron had decayed. The air was dry but not dusty. On the back wall, the carving had expanded. Each of the 7 drops now bore individual lines, resembling teeth marks or script scratched by fingernails. Experts disagreed whether the carving was natural erosion or purposeful. One linguist believed the marks resembled early Phoenician symbols, but only partially. After the rediscovery, locals began to speak of the cell again, not as a haunted space, but as a room of chosen silence. Every October 13th, the day believed to coincide with her arrival, a black cloth is left, draped over the sealed door, folded 3 times, with a stone placed on top. No one knows who places it. There is no signage, no tourism, only visitation by word of mouth, and always in silence. Between 1931 and 1954, 3 caretakers of the ruins filed notes about the room. The floor hums, but only when no one speaks. A young visitor fainted and said she saw someone kneeling, not in black, but in smoke. Plants die in the threshold, but grow well in the garden behind the room. Despite this, no official record attributes supernatural activity to the site. Scholars often classify it as a cultural echo, the mind projecting meaning onto old stone. But those who visit tend to disagree. One modern visitor described the feeling as not haunted, not sacred, just deeply occupied by intention. In 2008, a Jesuit archivist discovered a letter misfiled in the Poitiers diocesan vault, dated 1310, signed Onlyus L. The letter included this line: "The vow was never to be silent. The vow was to speak only when could no longer be denied. Until then, she promised to carry the language of the unseen. No recipient, no further context." But the archivist noted the initials SL matched only one recorded resident of Fort St. Lien during that decade. Sir Lien, the abbess who bricked the door shut. Theology often defines vows as spoken contract with God, pronounced aloud, witnessed by community. But what Sir Noir seemed to embody was a living vow, not of speech, but of architecture. Her cell was not just residence. It was her body extended into stone. Her disappearance was not escape. It was completion, like punctuation. In 2020, a photographer exploring monastic ruins claimed that the Black Vault echoed not sound, but heartbeat. Her field notes read, "I heard nothing when I spoke, but when I stood still, I heard something that made me feel named, not by voice, but by presence." Did Sir Noir vanish because she fulfilled her vow, or because we lacked the language to hear what she became? And if silence can shape a room for 700 years, what else might be speaking to the walls we no longer listen to? By the mid-1700s, Fort St. Lien had fallen into ruin. It was too remote to serve the state, too austere to be reformed into a proper abbey, and too associated with silence to attract pilgrimage. It became a place erased by logistics, not legend. Yet the locals never forgot. When a local bishopric proposed demolishing the remains in 1799, a group of nearby villagers petitioned to spare the southern wing. They wrote, "It has a silence that belongs to no one, and for that it belongs to all." The demolition was canceled. No official reason was recorded. In the early 1800s, peasant girls from nearby villages were known to walk barefoot to the ruins before arranged marriages. Not to pray, not to ask, but to listen. They would kneel near the brick cell and whisper only this: "Tell me if it is truly mine." If the breeze answered, they would marry. If not, they would delay, claiming illness or bad omens. Over time, this became known as La Ligne Muette, the mute line. It was never sanctioned, never punished, never proven, but it remained,